When a heartbroken consultant agrees to a blind date on New Year's Eve, he never expects to meet Savannah, a woman whose past pain mirrors his own. But a shocking discovery about their intertwined histories forces Matthew to confront a decade of guilt and grief he thought he had buried forever. Will they find healing together, or will their scars keep them apart? This emotional journey will leave you believing in second chances, fate, and the unbreakable power of love. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Matthew Collins adjusted his dark blue tie for the third time, catching his reflection in the polished elevator doors of the Lantern, Boston's newest and most exclusive restaurant. His 42-year-old face, framed by carefully combed dark hair, bore the quiet creases of a man who had spent the better part of a decade existing rather than living. Faint lines carved by sleepless nights and silent regrets lingered around his eyes, reminders of everything he'd left unsaid and undone. He exhaled slowly, whispering the words his best friend Oliver Grant had drilled into him. "You need this." Like a mantra against the rising tide of panic. The elevator chimed and the doors slid open, releasing him into a world of golden chandeliers, crystal stemware, and soft jazz swirling beneath conversations brimming with hope and champagne. Couples laughed at private jokes, families toasted to new beginnings. Matthew hesitated on the threshold, acutely aware of the chasm between himself and the vibrant life around him. But then he thought of Oliver's relentless insistence, of the loneliness that had wrapped itself around him like a second skin, and forced himself forward. A host in a sleek black suit led him to a table tucked in the corner, offering a breathtaking view of the Charles River glittering under the December moon. "Your guest hasn't arrived yet, sir," the host said with a polite smile, pulling out a chair. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" "Bourbon. Neat," Matthew said, his voice a little too quick. He sat, hands folded tightly together, pretending not to notice the curious glances from nearby tables. As he waited, he replayed the scant details Oliver had given him about his date. Savannah Brooks, 39 years old, a civil rights lawyer who had just made partner at one of the city's top firms. Brilliant, beautiful, and strong enough to turn your whole damn world upside down, Oliver had said with a conspiratorial grin. Matthew wasn't sure if he needed his world turned upside down, or if he was even capable of letting anyone close enough to try. The bourbon arrived, amber and burning, and Matthew sipped it slowly, savoring the heat sliding down his throat. He almost convinced himself to leave, to slip out before she arrived, preserving the safety of isolation. He had perfected the art of retreat. But before he could rise, a ripple of movement near the entrance caught his eye. She walked in like a storm contained in silk and grace. Savannah wore a royal blue dress that hugged her figure with effortless elegance, the color making her rich brown skin glow under the chandeliers. Her natural hair was styled in intricate braids that crowned her head like a halo, but it was her smile, easy, radiant, completely unguarded, that hit Matthew hardest, stealing the air from his lungs. She spoke briefly with the host, then turned, their eyes meeting across the room like an invisible thread snapping taut between them. For a heartbeat, everything else faded, the music, the chatter, even the gnawing fear in Matthew's chest. Savannah's smile widened, the kind of smile that dared him to stay, dared him to believe in things like second chances. She approached with steady, confident steps, and Matthew, scrambling for composure, rose so abruptly he nearly knocked over his bourbon. She laughed softly, the sound like a velvet ribbon unfurling. "You must be Matthew," she said, her voice low, rich, and threaded with amusement. "I'm Savannah. The pleasure's mine." Matthew cleared his throat, offering her the chair with a clumsy but genuine gallantry. It's very good to meet you," he said, cursing the awkwardness he thought he'd outgrown years ago. As Savannah settled into her seat, the scent of jasmine and something darker, like midnight rain, drifted toward him, dizzying and unexpectedly comforting. She rested her elbows lightly on the table, studying him with eyes that missed nothing but judged even less. "Oliver warned me you'd be punctual," she teased gently. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." "Not at all," Matthew lied with a grateful smile. "I just got here myself." He hadn't. But some lies, he decided, were born from kindness, not deceit. As they opened their menus and began the cautious dance of small talk, Matthew felt a flicker of something dangerous and precious awaken inside him, a whisper of hope, trembling but undeniable. Maybe, just maybe, tonight was not the end of another lonely year, but the beginning of something entirely unexpected. Their conversation began cautiously, like two dancers learning each other's rhythms in the flickering candlelight. Matthew asked her how she knew Oliver, grateful for a simple question to bridge the canyon of unfamiliarity. Savannah smiled over the rim of her wineglass, her eyes twinkling. "Oliver and I went to law school together," she said. "He was the loudest, most stubborn person in our study group. Still is, I imagine." Matthew chuckled, the sound feeling surprisingly easy in his chest. "He's relentless," he agreed. "He spent a month convincing me to come tonight." "A month?" Savannah raised an eyebrow. "I should be flattered you surrendered." "You should be," Matthew said without thinking, the words slipping out unvarnished. Her smile deepened, and he realized he didn't regret the honesty. They ordered dinner. She chose the seared duck with blackberry glaze, he picked the braised short ribs, and somewhere between the first glass of wine and the second, the distance between them shrank. Savannah spoke with a deliberate grace, weaving stories of her childhood in Atlanta, her dreams of becoming a lawyer since she was a teenager, watching courtroom dramas with her father. Matthew found himself telling her things he hadn't shared with anyone in years. How he had once dreamed of writing novels, how he had spent his 20s scribbling short stories in coffee shops, chasing publication, before life convinced him that security was safer than passion. "And now?" Savannah asked, twirling her wineglass by the stem. "What do you do?" "Financial consulting," Matthew said, his smile wry. "Spreadsheets and quarterly reports, thrilling stuff." "You don't sound thrilled," Savannah teased gently. He shrugged. "It's stable, predictable. After everything that felt important." Savannah's gaze sharpened, catching the weight behind his words. "After what?" Matthew hesitated, fingers tightening around his glass. The walls he'd built around that part of his life loomed, old and stubborn. But Savannah's expression held no pressure, only patient curiosity. "My brother," he said finally. "Sam, he died 10 years ago. Motorcycle accident." "I'm so sorry," Savannah said softly, her voice wrapping around the words like a balm. "I know that kind of loss." Matthew looked up, surprised. She set her glass down, her hand steady even as a flicker of old pain crossed her face. "My fiancé," she said. "Marcus. 8 years ago. A sudden heart aneurysm. One moment we were planning our wedding, and the next—" She exhaled, the breath shaky but controlled. "Life has a cruel way of rewriting your story without asking first." There it was, the invisible thread that had tugged them toward each other from the start. Shared grief, worn differently, but woven from the same fabric. Matthew leaned forward, the noise of the restaurant fading into a distant hum. "How do you?" he started, then stopped, unsure how to ask without sounding broken. Savannah understood anyway. "How do I keep going?" she finished for him, smiling sadly. "Some days I don't know. Other days you just put one foot in front of the other. You honor their memory by not letting yours end with theirs." Matthew stared at her, humbled by her strength. In all his years of loneliness, he had never found anyone who understood the hollow ache he carried. Until now. Their entrees arrived, giving them a moment to breathe. The aroma of rich sauces and roasted vegetables filled the air, but Matthew barely noticed. Across the table, Savannah caught his eye, a playful spark reigniting. "So," she said, slicing into her duck with elegant precision, "is this the moment where we share embarrassing first date stories?" Matthew laughed, grateful for the shift in energy. "Only if you're prepared to be thoroughly unimpressed." "I'm a lawyer, Matthew," Savannah said with a mock seriousness. "I'm trained to endure disappointment." He smiled, feeling something unfamiliar but unmistakable stirring in his chest. Hope. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like he was surviving a night. It felt like he was living it. As the clock ticked closer to midnight and the restaurant buzzed with anticipation for the new year, Matthew realized he didn't want this night to end. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And when Savannah caught his gaze and smiled, truly smiled, he dared to believe she felt the same. The new year arrived with fireworks blazing over the Charles River, their reflections dancing across the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. Around them, couples kissed, champagne flowed, and strangers toasted with reckless optimism. Matthew and Savannah clinked their glasses together, smiling shyly at each other over the rim. "To new beginnings," Savannah said, her voice low and earnest. "To second chances," Matthew added, surprised by how much he meant it. They lingered long after the plates had been cleared, savoring the comfortable hush that had fallen between them. When the bill finally came, Savannah reached for her purse, but Matthew shook his head, already pulling out his card. "Let me," he said. "Consider it my first good decision of the year." Savannah laughed, the sound rich and musical, and for a moment Matthew forgot every reason he'd built those walls around his heart. They stepped out into the brisk Boston air together, their breath mingling in white clouds. "I don't want this night to end," Savannah admitted, pulling her coat tighter around her, "but my feet are killing me in these heels." Matthew hesitated, heart pounding against his ribs. "What if it didn't have to end yet? Are you hungry for coffee? Or pancakes?" Savannah grinned. "Are you proposing second dinner at midnight? Isn't that what resolutions are for?" he teased. "To do more of what makes you happy?" She studied him for a moment, weighing her options, then reached for her phone. "My apartment's 5 minutes from here. Best coffee in town. And I make a mean stack of blueberry pancakes." Matthew smiled, feeling the kind of reckless bravery he hadn't known in years. "Lead the way." The ride to Savannah's building was a blur of easy conversation and stolen glances. Her apartment, tucked inside a historic brownstone near Beacon Hill, was a warm blend of modern touches and personal treasures. African masks hung beside law books, family photos shared shelf space with travel souvenirs. It felt alive, vibrant, like her. "Make yourself at home," Savannah said, tossing her keys onto a side table. She kicked off her heels with a relieved sigh. "Pancakes or coffee first?" "Surprise me," Matthew said, wandering over to a wall covered in framed photographs. In one, a much younger Savannah smiled wide, arms slung around a regal elderly woman wearing a bright yellow scarf. "That's my grandmother, Ruth," Savannah said, noticing his interest. "She practically raised me. Sharpest mind I've ever met." "She looks like the kind of woman who runs the world," Matthew observed. Savannah chuckled. "She does, in her own way." Matthew turned back to her, studying the way her face softened when she spoke of family. A pang of longing hit him square in the chest, memories of his brother Sam flashing unbidden, laughing at stupid jokes, daring each other to dream bigger, promising they'd always have each other's backs. He swallowed hard against the sudden wave of grief. "You okay?" Savannah asked, catching the flicker of pain before he could mask it. Matthew nodded, but the words caught in his throat. Maybe it was the late hour, the wine, the intimacy of her home, but suddenly the truth tumbled out. "My brother Sam, we weren't speaking when he died," he said hoarsely. "We had a stupid fight. I told him I was too busy to come visit. He never called again." Savannah set down the coffee pot and crossed to him, her steps slow and deliberate. She reached for his hand without hesitation, her fingers warm and steady against his. "You loved him," she said simply. That's all he would have needed to know. Matthew stared at her, feeling the words settle into a place inside him he'd kept walled off for years. Savannah squeezed his hand once, then released him with a sad smile. "I know a little something about guilt," she added. "It doesn't get lighter by carrying it alone." He wanted to say something. "Thank you, I'm sorry, don't let go." But before he could, Savannah's face shifted, her brow furrowing slightly. "Wait a second," she said, reaching for a framed photo from a side table. It was an old picture, grainy and faded, of a yellow house with white trim. "My grandmother's house in Charlottesville," Savannah explained, "where I spent every summer growing up, where she still lives." Matthew's stomach twisted, a strange buzzing filling his ears. "Charlottesville?" "Yeah," Savannah said, smiling fondly. "Maple Street. She's lived there for over 50 years. Matthew's heart slammed into his ribs. "My brother's accident?" His voice cracked. "It happened on Maple Street." Savannah froze, the color draining from her face. For a long, breathless moment, they stared at each other, realization dawning like a slow, unstoppable sunrise. "You don't think?" Savannah whispered. "I need to meet your grandmother," Matthew said, his voice breaking with something between awe and terror. "I need to know." Outside, the world was wrapped in the first quiet snowfall of the year. But inside Savannah's apartment, a different kind of storm had begun to stir. one that would change both their lives forever. The road stretched out ahead of them, slick with the sheen of melted snow under a pale winter sun. Savannah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening as the city fell away behind them, and the open spaces of Virginia unfurled like a map she hadn't read in years. Matthew sat beside her, silent, watching the landscape shift from concrete to farmland, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. Some silences were heavy, filled with unspoken questions and rising fear. Others were oddly comforting, a quiet understanding passing between them with each glance, each sigh. Matthew caught himself tracing the curve of her profile with his eyes more than once, how her braids caught the light, how her jaw tightened every time they passed a familiar landmark. He wanted to reach for her hand but kept still, afraid that if he broke the fragile thread holding them together, he might not find the courage to tie it back again. As they pulled into the quaint, tree-lined streets of Charlottesville, Matthew felt his pulse pick up. Memories he had buried deep, the gut-wrenching phone call, the funeral, the years of self-recrimination, began to claw their way back to the surface. Savannah pointed ahead. "That's Maple Street," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's stomach twisted. He scanned the houses as they turned onto the street, tall oaks casting long shadows, mailboxes leaning slightly from years of use, front porches sagging under the weight of time and memory. And then he saw it. The yellow house with white trim, just like the photograph Savannah had shown him. It looked almost exactly the same, as if frozen in the moment when his life had veered off course. Savannah parked the car along the curb. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Savannah said, her hand finding his on the center console. "I need to," Matthew said, his voice thick. "For him. For me." They climbed the porch steps slowly, the wood creaking under their feet. Before they could knock, the front door swung open, and there she was. Ruth Brooks? As regal and commanding as the photo had suggested, wrapped in a vibrant purple shawl that contrasted beautifully with her silver hair. "Lord have mercy," Ruth said, pressing a hand to her chest. Her sharp eyes flickered between Savannah and Matthew, and something like recognition seemed to dawn instantly. "Come on in, babies. We've been expecting you." Inside, the house was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Family photos covered the walls, faces smiling out across generations. Ruth led them into the sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth, a plate of cookies sitting untouched on a low table. Matthew sat stiffly on the edge of a floral couch, while Savannah perched beside him, her presence steadying even as nerves threatened to consume him. "I remember that night clear as yesterday," Ruth began, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I was sitting right here, reading, when I heard the crash. Loud and sharp. I ran outside, didn't even think to grab a coat. That's when I saw him, the young man in the blue jacket." Matthew's breath caught. Sam had a blue jacket, always that battered denim one he refused to throw away. "He was hurt bad," Ruth continued, her voice trembling slightly, "but he was awake, aware. I wrapped him in the emergency quilt I kept by the door, navy blue with gold stars. He gripped my hand so tight." She paused, swallowing. He said he was sorry, that he wished he'd made things right with his brother." Tears pricked Matthew's eyes, his throat burned. "And then," Ruth said, reaching for his hand, "he asked me to tell his brother that none of it was his fault, that he was proud of him, that he wanted him to live a full life. Tell him not to waste it," he said. Matthew bowed his head, unable to stop the tears sliding down his cheeks. Savannah squeezed his hand, grounding him. "I prayed with him," Ruth said quietly, held his hand until the ambulance came. "He wasn't alone, baby. He left this world wrapped in love." Matthew closed his eyes, letting those words wash over him like a tide breaking through years of self-inflicted guilt. He hadn't been there, but someone good, someone kind, had been. When he opened his eyes again, Ruth was smiling at him through her own tears. "He's been watching over you," she said. "Now it's time for you to start living like he would have wanted." Savannah leaned her head lightly against Matthew's shoulder, and for the first time in a decade, he let himself believe that maybe he could. Maybe the future wasn't just something to endure. Maybe it was something to build, together. The drive back to Boston was different. lighter somehow, though the weight of everything they'd uncovered still pressed against Matthew's chest in a way he wasn't ready to name. Savannah drove with one hand lightly resting on the wheel, the other brushing against his knee every so often, as if to remind him she was there, that he wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. They talked in fits and starts about the future, small things at first, dinner plans, a new coffee shop Savannah wanted to try, Matthew's tentative dreams of writing again. But somewhere around Hartford, the conversation grew more serious. "I got offered a promotion," Savannah said, her voice casual, but Matthew heard the nerves underneath. "Director of the pro bono division. It's what I've wanted for years." "That's incredible," Matthew said, meaning every word. "It comes with a pay cut," she added with a wry smile. "Helping people doesn't always pay well." Matthew thought about the apartment searches they'd half-joked about, the dreams they'd sketched on napkins between pancakes and coffee. "We'll figure it out," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We'll find a way." Savannah glanced over at him, something tender in her expression. "I don't want to just survive, Matthew. I want to live. Really live." "Me too," he said, and meant it more deeply than he ever had before. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Morning coffee runs turned into spontaneous breakfast dates. Walks along the Charles River stretched into lazy afternoons exploring neighborhoods they might one day call home. In stolen moments between meetings and obligations, Matthew wrote, scribbling scenes and characters that felt startlingly alive, no longer shackled by fear. It was during one of those late-night writing sessions, sitting at Savannah's kitchen counter, that he realized it. Life wasn't waiting to happen. It was happening now, messy and beautiful and breathtaking. Savannah's voice broke his reverie. "Found another one," she said, dropping onto the stool beside him and turning her laptop screen toward him. "A listing for a garden-level apartment on Marlborough Street. 3 bedrooms, exposed brick, tiny backyard garden. It's perfect," she said, biting her lip. "But it's at the top of our budget." Matthew closed his laptop without hesitation. "Then let's stretch. Let's bet on us." Savannah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she smiled. Slow and luminous and full of all the things Matthew had spent a lifetime thinking he didn't deserve. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's do it." The next morning, they toured the apartment hand in hand, sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting golden pools across hardwood floors. They signed the lease that afternoon, laughing over the absurdity of it all, drunk on hope. Matthew quit his consulting job 2 weeks later. "You're crazy," Oliver said when Matthew told him over beers one night. Beautifully, brilliantly crazy. Matthew just smiled. For once, it didn't feel like madness. It felt like faith. He poured himself into the novel, writing until his fingers cramped, until the sun rose unnoticed outside the windows. Savannah worked late nights at the pro bono office, returning home exhausted but energized, her passion burning bright enough to set the whole city ablaze. And somehow, through the chaos and the fear, they built a life together. On a crisp Sunday morning, as Matthew sat at their worn kitchen table rereading the final pages of his manuscript, Savannah slid a small envelope across to him. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Inside was a tiny sonogram photo, a blur of black and white and possibility. "We're having a baby," she said, tears shining in her eyes. Matthew stared at the image, emotions crashing over him in relentless waves, terror, wonder, awe. He looked up to find Savannah watching him, vulnerable and radiant. "We should name her Ruth," he said hoarsely. "Or Sam, if it's a boy." Savannah laughed through her tears, nodding. "Ruth or Sam," she agreed. "Either way, this child will know they come from love, from courage, from stories that refuse to stay broken." Matthew stood, gathering her into his arms, the sonogram crushed gently between them. Outside, the garden stirred under the first blush of spring. Inside, a new story was already beginning. And this time, Matthew wasn't just ready. He was all in. Life has a way of throwing detours into our carefully mapped-out journeys. Sometimes grief and regret convince us that it's safer to build walls than to risk being hurt again. But Matthew and Savannah's story reminds us of something profoundly beautiful. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we dare to open ourselves up to connection. to love, to forgiveness, and to second chances. Through facing the pain of their pasts, they discovered that brokenness doesn't mean the end of the story. It can be the very beginning of something extraordinary. Their journey teaches us that true living isn't about avoiding loss. It's about embracing every precious, imperfect moment and finding the courage to love again, even when it terrifies us. It's about understanding that some connections are more than coincidence. They are life's quiet miracles, waiting for us to be brave enough to embrace them. No matter how much time passes or how deep the wounds run, it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, laughter, and love that transcends all fear. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this heartfelt journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remind us all. Healing, love, and second chances are always possible.